Hi everybody, in this video I'll be reviewing China and specifically reviewing China for tourists. If you're visiting China as a tourist, what would be things to help you out when you visit the country and exploring the country. So I visited China in 2016. I spent about a month and a half there. My wife is Chinese, so I kind of have a more inside view of China than probably most tourists that visit it just for a short time. So I've visited Liaoning province, which is in the northeast of China. It's bordering, the eastern part of that province is bordering North Korea, and I also visited Beijing. And I took a train from Liaoning province, from Dalian, the city of Dalian. It's a major seaport in China and in Liaoning province, to Beijing. So I saw the countryside between those two cities as well. So I wanted to discuss some more general China topics, so that's why I decided to create a review of the whole country rather than these specific parts. So China is obviously a very big country. The Northeast and Beijing, to me, seemed very similar in terms of culture, in terms of the dialect they speak. There's a distinct R sound in Chinese that they both use. And also historically, the Qing dynasty spread from the northeast to Beijing, so they literally moved their capital from the northeast, Shenyang, to Beijing. So these two regions are very interrelated. So one thing that probably should be mentioned more about China for tourists is that as far as the physical safety, it's extremely safe. It's probably one of the safest countries in the world. You wouldn't have any problem traveling there or staying there, just walking around late at night or doing anything at night. It's extremely safe. However, you have to be aware of scams for tourists. The scams of tourists are typically like very kind of innocent type things that the Chinese are trying to do to tourists, but nevertheless they're not very pleasant. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is with not returning you the right change when you buy something. Let's say they have to give you back 4 yuan, but instead of 4 yuan they give you 3 yuan, something like that. You have to really understand Chinese money when you go there, because they'll try to scam you. That happened to me. They tried to scam me a few times with minor, I should say it was with minor change amounts, but nevertheless they looked at me, obviously knew I was a foreigner there, and they tried to kind of take advantage of that. The other scam that I personally also was involved in was with tickets. So specifically, I took a tour. I bought a tour to visit the Great Wall from Beijing, and the price for the tour was extremely low. It was lower than the typical price, and it was all, they handed you a brochure, everything seemed legit. Of course you had your doubts, but how could you know? But then at the end they tried to extort more money, although the price was pre-negotiated. So in that case, you have to be aggressive. You have to become like the Chinese when you're there. When somebody's trying to cheat you, just just give them the money you agreed to and leave, because there's no point to argue with them. Some Chinese in that respect can be very unscrupulous, very aggressive. So as far as travel within China, especially if you're traveling long distance, the high-speed trains are extremely popular. My impression is they're cheaper than flying, and they're used by a lot of Chinese. The thing about the high-speed trails you need to know is that you need to book them in advance. They usually fill up very quickly, so you need to book them a few days earlier. There's a high demand for them because they're very fast, and they're actually very good quality, you know, very clean, with good service, and just you need to plan ahead when you try to use them. Another option for you to travel in China, kind of shorter distances, if you're traveling within one province, is you can take a bus. I had a good experience taking a bus from Dalian to Banxi, which is another city in Liaoning province, and I find the experience very pleasant. The bus was a good quality one. As far as the Chinese culture, you need to know, you know, China in itself I felt like it's its own world. You know, it's very different from the West, and it's also different from other Asian countries, from my understanding. So when you're there, you feel like you're in a different world. My impression is, you know, I'm originally from Bulgaria, so Bulgaria used to be a communist country, and although it was not part of the Soviet Union, it had a heavy Soviet influence. So I experienced the same thing in China. It seemed like the country has been heavily influenced by the Soviet Union. You know, it's still a communist country, and a lot of things are still, you know, felt like it's been influenced by the Soviet Union and Russia. You know, specifically the architecture, you know, just the way that cities are planned, and everything is kind of centralized. So it's you know, actually it reminded me a lot about Bulgaria in a lot of respects. Although I must mention, you know, China is a very big country, and it's a very strong country in terms of economy and, you know, industry and so on. But in a lot of respects, it seemed like behind. You know, I'll just give you one example. You know, a lot of people still smoke, and you know, it seems like a lot of things are not to the standard of the West. You know, for example, the buildings are not maintained so well, you know, and things in the public space don't seem to be working as good as efficiently in the West. They seem to be kind of behind. Another example is in the medical area. You know, their hospitals seem to be behind also. As far as food, you know, I was very surprised because I visited North China. You know, when you think of China, you think about rice, but actually rice is a staple food only in the south. In the north, they use a lot of noodles and dumplings. Actually, in Europe, we eat probably more rice than in northern China, you know, which was kind of a shock to me, because I always thought rice is a very common dish in China. The thing that also was a very big surprise for me was the people. The people look different. When you think of Chinese people, if you're not from there, you know, the typical stereotype of a Chinese person is that they're all very similar, if not the same. But actually, when you go there, you feel like these are completely different people. There's a lot of different ethnicities, and I'm not sure if the official 56 minorities are the same as the different way people look, but especially in Beijing, it seemed like a lot of people look very different from each other. However, based on my tourist impression, culturally they're very similar. They seem to celebrate the same holidays, and they seem to have the same outlook on life, and use Chinese characters and so on. So they have a lot of common things, and although they don't look the same, they seem to have the same culture. However, one thing very interesting thing I was kind of very curious about was actually they have this Hui minority in China, which is the main Muslim minority, and I was curious to see if they have this drink. It's called buza. It's very common in the Balkans and the Middle East, and I was just checking to see if they have that in China, and actually they don't, at least not in the Northeast and in Beijing. So my point is the Muslim people, at least the Hui, are really ethnic Chinese who use, a lot of their food is actually, Chinese food. They actually don't have these same types of drinks or dishes from the Middle East. It's different. Another huge surprise for me about China when I visited was that there are very, very few foreigners in China. Beijing is a little bit of an exception. Although even in Beijing there are very few foreigners, but my overall impression of China is there are extremely low number of foreigners. I grew up in Bulgaria. I thought we don't have many foreigners in Bulgaria, but even compared to Bulgaria, in China there's much less foreigners. In Dalian, in the city in the Liaoning province, there was a period of about 3 days at one time that I didn't see a single foreigner. And Dalian is considered an open city. It's one of the major ports in China. Let me see what else. You need to be aware of, the good thing about China is it's very cheap. It's very affordable. Things are much cheaper than in the West. Another major thing you need to be aware of is that there's a huge variety of everything in China compared to the West. Just to give you an example, when you go to a fish shop there, like a what do you call it, like a animal store, they have, let's say they have like 200 varieties of fish, for example, and when you go to a typical store here in the US, they have maybe, let's say, 50. It's times and times more than in the West, and that's pretty much for everything that I could find, like food, drinks, animals, you name it. Everything has a much more variety than in the West. And let me see what else. That's pretty much it. These are my overall impressions of China. I hope you find that useful. I highly recommend that you visit China. It's an amazing country. Be prepared for some culture shock if you haven't been to Asia, but overall, Chinese people might have a different culture and might have, they live in their own world really, but actually, I'm from Eastern Europe. I felt like we're closer to them than I expected, because China and Europe share the same landmass, and especially Eastern Europe is closer to Asia and to China. So actually it felt like, we're in our part of the world. Although it's very far, you know, it seemed like it's much different than if you're coming from North America. So that's all I had. If you have any specific questions, please let me know, and please don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you. Bye bye.